Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all see the screen. I'm Tony from Olwg. Simon's going to be presenting 15 minutes of insights this afternoon. We've started the session just to share some periodic insights of things that we've learned. We don't have all the answers, but this is a session really to generate a little bit of discussion. A little bit of housekeeping. The session is going to be recorded. Once we start, I'll switch off my camera and mic. I'll be muting everybody else. Simon will be talking. And then during Simon's talk, the Q&A box will be open. You can post any comments that you have, questions, and then at the end of the 15 minutes, I'll pick out some of the questions to get some answers on. So on that note then, let me hand over to Simon. I'm going to go mute and I'll switch off. Simon, is your mic working?
Yes.
Right, over to you. Sorry, Simon, I seem to have muted you as well. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the slides and can hear me speaking now. If you can't, just post to let us know, and we'll try and fix any technical problems. So as Tony said, this is not about presenting the right answer. This is about putting a few thoughts out there in a very short period of time, and then having a Q&A, and then having a discussion for those that want to carry on a debate or a discussion. So I'll start with this quote from James Stockdale, which is a very famous quote, which is that you must never confuse the faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. So I'll talk a little bit about the brutal facts of our situation and why net zero is a very difficult place to get to in terms of carbon emissions. Right, next slide. So this is the first graph. This shows the percentage of renewables as the percentage total share of final energy consumption. It's IEA data. So that's the first graph. And the second graph shows the change in how much renewable energy capacity we have globally. So the first thing to note is if you look at the global share of renewable energy as a total share, in the last 20 years, this only goes up to 2017 because it's the nature of IEA data, it always lags. But in the last 20 years, that number has not significantly changed. It was about 17% in 2000. I looked at 2020 data, it's about 17% today. China, East Asia, Southeast Asia, that number's dropped. Europe and North America, that's risen slightly, but overall it's not changed. And that's despite the amount of renewable energy capacity doubling. The interesting thing is if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, on the IEA data, that has a very high percentage of renewable energy as total final energy consumption. But I'm going to talk about why that's the case in a minute, and some interesting observations to make about that. Energy use per person in kilograms oil equivalent. This is data from a website called Gapminder, which is Hans Rosling's website that analyses lots of data. Sadly, Hans Rosling is no longer with us. But he's done some work in this. For those who don't understand kilograms of oil equivalent, I've converted it into kettle hours. So the amount of hours you would boil a kettle for on the axis. So you'll see straight away that one of the top energy users are places like the United States. Then we have places like Australia, Russia, United Kingdom is down here, China is here. And then a country of Nigeria is right at the bottom. Energy use is falling, which is the good news, apart from China. And that's because China's experiencing rapid economic growth. Russia is kind of increased and then decreased. Australia has decreased, a little bit of a pickup in 2018. The other thing is to think about population. So we've got Nigeria at the bottom here. It doesn't use much energy, but it's got quite a large population. China uses quite a bit of energy, but it's got a very large population. So the question is, or the problem is, as these countries develop economically, it's likely that these numbers are going to move up, even though in more developed nations these numbers are moving down. So the likelihood is that energy use per person is likely to go up, not down. If some of these countries like Nigeria, these countries in Africa start developing, we will see an increase in energy consumption. I did say that I'd explain why Sub-Saharan Africa has a very high amount of renewable energy, and this is the reason. Wood fuel used for cooking. So one of the peculiarities of IEA data and IRENA data, they count wood fuel as a renewable energy source. Now, wood fuel is enormously problematic. In Nigeria, I know for a fact that it is one of the most significant causes of infant mortality for under 5s. So in-house home pollution causes quite big home health issues. And in a country like Nigeria, most of the energy that's used, particularly in rural areas, is simply burning wood. So in fact, that number would further depress that total share of renewable energy globally from its 17%, the fact that we're using a lot of wood fuel. So that's one of the problems. The next slide I'll show is CO2 emissions per person. So this is the amount of CO2 emitted per person in each country. So top of the list, countries like Qatar, UAE, Australia. Sorry, this is in tons per person. This balloon with this person shows you what a ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere looks like. And then, not surprisingly, those countries that use the least amount of energy, countries like Nigeria and Chad that are not developed countries, actually contribute very, very little CO2. China has grown, but is still not at the level of Australia and the United States as CO2 emissions per person, and it has China has flattened up. So a few features on this graph: CO2 emissions are dropping, which is good. United Kingdom, Australia, United States has fallen. China has grown quite rapidly as they've developed economically. It started to level up. United Kingdom has continued to grow. Russia is still growing. Countries like Nigeria and Chad are stuck right at the bottom. And that's because they are not economically developed, they're not using up a lot of energy, so they're not producing a lot of CO2. Again, if they develop economically, these numbers are likely to go up unless they adopt renewables from day one. So again, the picture is with CO2 emissions, unless we have enough renewables on the planet, and bearing in mind we've only got about 17% of total energy capacity, as countries developed, CO2 emissions are likely to go up. So we have a gap in equality of energy and equality of income, and to narrow that gap, either Nigeria and Chad, countries like Nigeria and Chad have to increase energy use but use clean energy, or developed countries have to reduce their energy usage and CO2 production to offset the CO2 that's likely to be developed in developing countries. So there is both a potential CO2 problem that's down the track, and there's also a potential disparity in energy use. And that really comes out in this last graph, which is GDP per capita, gross domestic product by capita. This one is inflation adjusted, so it's normalized for inflation on a PPP basis. So they are comparable, and not surprising, United States, country like the United States, use lots of energy, have a very high GDP. Nigeria, very low GDP, doesn't use a lot of energy. China rapidly growing. Russia's a bit in the doldrums. remember, United Kingdom uses less energy than the United States, produces less CO2, but its GDP capita is approaching the United States, but not as high. Just for inference, 40,000 GDP is about the price of the cheaper Tesla car, the cheapest Tesla car you can buy. So just to put that in that context, and that's GDP annually per capita. So countries with high GDP use a lot of energy and produce the most CO2. Okay, so the question is, what do we do about it? So we've talked about a little bit about some global trends, and we can talk about what they really mean. From those global trends, we can understand some of the potential threats towards preventing us from reaching net zero: energy growth in developing countries, continued economic growth forcing up CO2 emissions. Renewables are not keeping pace with energy growth, so as a consequence, the total share of renewable energy isn't really improving. It's stuck somewhere at 17%. So last year, when I started looking at energy, I came across, first of all, I came across the idea of energy efficiency. So energy efficiency is really, if you put energy at the beginning of a process, how much energy do you get out at the end and how much losses do you make? I'm not going to get into the real detail of how those calculations are made or even Sankey diagrams. But if we just compare a very simple example in terms of energy efficiency, then we can look at home heating. We can think about an oil furnace, an electric heater or a heat pump. And an oil furnace, including its losses, if you're turning that fuel, that potential energy in that fuel into heat, it's about 85% efficient. If you take a simple electric heater, where you're just heating an element in a bar, that is about 100% efficient. So you pretty much get out the same amount of heat as the energy you put in. Now, if you then look at a heat pump, because the heat pump makes use of ambient heat that surrounds your house from the atmosphere or from the ground or from water, that's very efficient. So for every 1 unit of energy you put in, you'll get 3 units of heat out. So that's one way of looking at the world, but there is another way of looking at the world, which is Exergy. And I'm not a thermodynamicist, I'm not an expert. And the simplest way I can explain Exergy is you answer the question, how much useful energy do I destroy in that process? So if we think about a unit of electricity that is unused, and we're generating that electricity, but we haven't yet used it, then that electricity has the potential to do all sorts of work. We can use it for heating, we can use it to drive electric motors, we can use it for driving electronics. So it's an incredibly useful energy. And the question is, well, to do that job, how much of that energy are we going to destroy? And that's the example for energy. So when you look at Exergy destruction, how much actual useful energy are you destroying? You can make a different calculation, which is an Exergy calculation. And in the case of an oil furnace, that's about 4% efficient. In the case of an electric heater, that's about 5% efficient, 95% destruction of Exergy. In the case of a heat pump, it's 15% efficient. So Exergy corresponds to that portion of energy flow which can be made to do useful work in the next conversion process. So it's about destruction. So my argument is, as engineers, if we want to solve the problem of carbon emissions and reaching net zero, if we want to attempt to reach net zero, generating more and more energy with renewables is not enough. It's really important to start to think about how can we use that energy most efficiently. And I say that because there is another brutal truth for renewable energy compared to hydrocarbon sources, that renewable energy has a much lower density. So hydrocarbons, and I'll take coal as an example, are extremely high quality fuels. They're very polluting, but they're high quality. And the reason I say they're high quality is because they pack a hell of a punch. And the reason something like coal or oil packs a hell of a punch is because it was made by planet Earth over millions and millions of years. So we took that fuel, we compressed it over millions of years, and we took all of that sunlight energy that's gone into plants, and those plants have died and have been buried, and that now has been buried and compressed. And so a lump of coal is thousands of years of sunlight energy, or a seam of coal. Whereas something like wind or solar has a much lower density. So if we accept that renewable energies have a lot lower energy density, we have to become more efficient. We can actually extend the Exergy idea to just general resource use. And in fact, that's something that's been done by environmentalists and people who are into sustainability. And so for me, a more useful definition of sustainability is that, does the human production of one unit of an economic good by method A use more or less resource of a resource's exergy, i.e. more or less resource, than by method B? So I would argue that engineering now needs to look at minimizing the amount of resource that is used to do a job. So if we look at a particular job, so let's imagine I need to get to the supermarket and I need to buy some stuff from the supermarket. Just a very simple question I could ask myself is, what is the least amount of resource I can use to get to that supermarket, get the food I need to fuel myself and get back home? Sorry about that, that's just my camera going on. Right. Sorry about that, I just had a timer on, I should have run it on silent. So the question is, how little resource can we use to do a job? And if we want to engineer a sustainable future, engineers have to start looking at resource utilization, whether it's input resources, minerals, raw materials, or energy. We have to minimize that resource. So that's really that really concludes our first session, and that's what I've got to say. So I'll open up the question to Q&A. I do have some backup slides from the UN that look at actually what the forecast is for net zero, and I can show that if those questions come up. And then we'll have a discussion. So I'll hand back to the moderator, Tony. Okay, Tony, thank you.
Yeah, cheers, Simon. Hopefully all that came across clearly. Right, we've got two questions at the moment. Both these have come from David Calver. I'll read out the first one. Can tech leapfrogging prevent or slow down the rate of increase in per capita energy use in developing countries that have rising populations? So in terms of that leapfrogging, tech leapfrogging, that means, yeah, leapfrogging of fossil fuels and high carbon.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So there are efforts to do that. So we can take the example of Nigeria, because it's a country I know a little bit about. I've recently completed a study on Nigeria. So Nigeria has made a lot of efforts, particularly in rural electrification, to try and introduce solar panels for providing power, and the Renewable Energy Agency in Nigeria have a very ambitious goal on electrification using solar. So they're focused on off-grid and they're focused on using local solar. They've spent quite a bit of money on it, but they haven't achieved anything like the objectives. They've probably hit about 5 to 10% of their target, and there's a few features that make it really challenging. The first thing is, it's really difficult to take westernized or Western-based technologies, modern technologies, and stick them straight into a rural, undeveloped environment. And there isn't really the on-the-ground capacity to adopt those technologies. And actually, you might argue they're too complicated. So they're talking about smart meters, batteries, solar. So they're introducing something that's very appropriate to the United Kingdom, but less appropriate to Nigeria. The second thing is cost. So there's not a lot of money. People don't have money to spend. So their primary concern is electricity. They just need electricity. And I've been discussing this with a few people recently. One of the things you have to do alongside providing technology is you have to lift people out of poverty. People in poverty do not have the finances to make good choices. If you lift people out of poverty, they will make a good choice. So you not only have to introduce technology, but you have to provide income, you have to provide economic development. Now the two things go hand in hand. So they're some of the challenges. The other things that sometimes we do is we ignore the simplest solution. So a very simplest solution for home cooking in Nigeria and reduction of home pollution and better use of solar energy is solar cookers. And solar cookers use sunlight concentrated to cook food in a very simple way. Can be manufactured locally. It generates local income for people who are making them. But bear in mind, if you are putting solar cells in Nigeria, there is a flux of money going out of Nigeria to the people who are making those solar cells. They don't make solar cells in Nigeria at the moment. So that's the other problem. So it's quite a complicated problem. But in theory, yes, we have to find policies that allow these countries to leapfrog. But it's more than just providing technology. It's about improving on the ground capability. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I've just got a follow-up question from David as well, so I'll read it out. So decoupling of economic success from carbon emissions hasn't yet happened. Are you optimistic that this decoupling can be a significant part of the plan for net zero?
Well, I'm going to go to a backup slide just briefly. So this graph shows current forecasts from the UN in their latest report, and it shows the projection of CO2 emissions in gigatons of CO2 based on the policies that are in place. So based through this decade, based on the current policies that are in place, countries make something that's called a nationally defined contribution. It's the thing they guarantee they will do. Based on that, based on current policies, no. Based on current policies, the most likely outcome is that CO2 will rise this decade. And there is a massive shortfall in the amount of, in the policies, massive shortfall and big gap in the policies to achieve CO2. So am I optimistic that it will happen? No. I believe that there is no chance of reducing CO2 emissions this decade based on both the technical trajectory and the way those technologies are implemented in policy. From a physics point of view, is it possible? Yes, absolutely, entirely. But we have to focus much more on demand side efficiencies. We have to reduce energy consumption. We cannot achieve that at current projected growth rates. So there are some economists now who are arguing that we, from an environmental perspective, from an environmental harm perspective, we can't actually afford economic growth. But that is a hot debate. And the economists are split. In fact, I would say the economists that believe that are in the minority. Most economists still believe that the market should decide, and the best way to decarbonise is through growth and introduction of new technologies, but it is currently a debate. I don't know the answer.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got a question here from Naveed. Do you think that Africa will go the same way as China in terms of per capita carbon footprint as it develops, or could it follow a different path due to starting off with a more renewable energy dominated footprint?
That's a very good question. To achieve the kind of growth that China has achieved, it is very difficult to see how you can do that through renewables alone. I mean, it is physically possible. There are some fundamental differences between Sub-Saharan Africa and China. So China has a very different political system. It has an authoritarian, autocratic system where they set 5-year plans. And so there is very little variation of policy once they set a policy in place. So for example, China is probably the place that has the biggest growth of renewables on the planet at the moment. They're probably increasing capacity of renewables faster than anyone else, but their energy is going up. Sub-Saharan Africa has a chaotic political scene at the moment, and you can't get away from the fact, and this is published and it's well referenced by authors who are based in Sub-Saharan Africa, from those countries, that there is a problem with corruption. And so one of the problems, for example, is that Nigeria is the 10th biggest oil producer in the world. 97% of that oil is exported, and yet 70% of people who live in rural locations have no access to electricity. And the question arises, well, where's that money going? Where is it being invested? And what are Western, or what are our richer OECD nations who receive that oil, what is their accountability for ensuring that that money is used for development? So it is a very, very difficult problem in Sub-Saharan Africa. I think on the whole, I can't see how they can avoid using carbon-based fuels to achieve growth, to bring them up to the level that we are in the UK. It is possible, but I'm not optimistic.
Cool, thanks for that. We've got a question here from Sue Sekon. So this is one that we talk about quite a lot. So to what extent is the so-called energy transition just all hype? So for example, hydrogen, CCUS, offshore wind, etc. What's your view on the hype?
So yeah, I'll be very careful in my comments. I'll try and drag it back to the Exergy conversation that I've started. So if we take the example of hydrogen, so hydrogen is not very efficient and it has a high Exergy cost. So the simplest example is if you want to convert all your cars to fuel cell cars, and you start by generating that wind with solar or wind, then the overall efficiency for a fuel cell vehicle is about 30%. So you're going to have about 70% losses. EVs is about 25% losses. So if you compare the two, hydrogen and electric vehicles are about 2.5 to 3 times more efficient. So if you want to go fuel cells, you have to triple the amount of renewable energy input. The other challenge with something like hydrogen is that you have to use an input energy to make it. It's an energy carrier. So you have to use natural gas and use steam methane reformation, or you have to use electricity. So in theory, hydrogen cannot be really any cheaper than the input electricity, and it has an efficiency penalty. Now, hydrogen does have some advantages in hard to decarbonise areas, so it probably has an advantage in very heavy vehicles, with vehicles with very high duty. It has some advantages, for example, on weight, so it might be a vector for aircraft, for example. And hydrogen's other redeeming feature is that it's storable. So a lot of renewable energy is not dispatchable. It's either on or it's off, and you either use it or you don't use it. So then you start to look around the world and you start to realise there's large parts of the world that have massive potential for renewable energy. So Sub-Saharan Africa, lots of sunlight, lots of heat, lots of wind as well in places, but it has got no market for electricity because not many people live there. So in theory, you could use that potential to make hydrogen and export the hydrogen to other parts of the world. The only caveat is we need to make sure that any revenue that's generated is actually used to benefit those populations. Otherwise, we just end up in the oil case of Nigeria. So carbon capture and storage is probably going to have to be used. The big problem with carbon capture and storage, and I'll use the example of the UK, is a lot of our carbon generation is dispersed. So I think about 30% of carbon that's generated in the UK comes from vehicles. A lot of the other carbon that's accounted for in the UK is scope 2, scope 3. It's not coming out of one chimney. So actually, the overall potential for decarbonisation, if you really get after it, I reckon you could, if you really went after it, you could get rid of somewhere between 15 and 25% through sequestration. The rest of it, you have to get rid of by using alternative energy vectors. I don't know if you've got a comment on that, Tony. On carbon storage. So.
I guess my main comment as an ex-process engineer on carbon capture is it's really energy intensive itself, and you only capture maybe 90% of the CO2.
Yeah, so it's quite expensive. I mean, roughly in the UK, you're looking at about 500 million capex investment in pounds to remove about 0.1% of the CO2 from the atmosphere, from the carbon budget per year, roughly. So it'll vary by a few hundred million, but it's quite expensive to remove not a lot of carbon. And you can probably remove more carbon more effectively through demand side efficiency gains, in my opinion. But there's no doubt that for some areas we're going to have to use it. I think when it's combined with SMR for hydrogen, and we use that hydrogen in the gas grid to basically reduce the amount of natural gas by spiking in hydrogen, it starts to make sense, but it's still quite expensive. It's going to be on a kilowatt hour basis, you know, it's going to be megawatt hour basis, it's going to be hundreds of pounds. It's going to be 10 times more expensive to use hydrogen than it is to use electricity, and 20-30 times more expensive than it is to use methane as it currently stands in the network. So it's expensive. So yeah. My comments, yeah.
Okay, good, thanks. We've got a question here from Julia. I think you've already touched on it a little bit. So what impact can the phase out of combustion engine vehicles have? Will this have a notable impact towards net zero, or take too long?
Well, the challenge, I'll put a challenge out there, and maybe we should open the discussion to, I don't know if you can actually open it up so other people can speak, Tony, and maybe give their opinion. I'll let you try and work out if that's possible, because it's 15 minutes of Q&A, and then give other people. So I'd open that question up and say, well, what do other people think? There are a few researchers that basically have said that if you think you're going to solve the emissions problem and get to net zero by simply electrifying all of your cars, then you're delusional, because those electric vehicles will still require energy. You still have to get that energy from somewhere. Renewables are relatively low density in energy. So in reality, the answer is electrification of vehicles and a lot less vehicles and a lot less vehicle use. And that comes back down to this whole idea of sustainability, resource utilisation, and Exergy. I can't tell you that's true, because I just haven't done the calculations. Although I know roughly for the UK, if you want to electrify all of the cars in the UK, you're looking at about I think it's about 300 terawatt hours or something like that of energy. So it's a huge amount of energy. So I don't know if anybody else wants to come in. I don't know if you've opened it up, Tony.
Well, I'm not sure. I guess because we haven't really used this format before, I'm not sure whether people can unmute themselves. So once I press that mute all, are people able to unmute? I guess I'd encourage people to try that if that works. I can't find another way to unmute the audience. So if that doesn't work, I mean, if people aren't able to unmute themselves, and I can't really find a way to do that, I'll just carry on reading out a few more questions,
yeah,
I think.
But if you want to write some comments down, then we'll read them out on your behalf. And hopefully next time we'll find a way to open up the debate. Okay.
Good, right, well, I'll keep going then for now. So there's a question here from Mehdi. I think you make very important points around demand. Using the supermarket example, food type availability is available 365 days, even though naturally it isn't the case. It seems we need a significant change in lifestyle to help reach transition targets sooner. And yeah, we often talk about just buying avocados and stuff. What other thoughts have you got on that, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, the UN have made a very good statement. They've said that they cannot foresee a situation in which we'll reach net zero unless there's a significant change in lifestyle. I kind of made the point myself that I think a lot of people are very ready to criticise the industry that's come before, the hydrocarbon industry. Yet it's absolutely true that the growth in energy consumption is directly related to the improvement in the health and well-being of every single person on the planet. Even the poorest nations have improved their health and well-being and their lifespan. And that's down to economic growth, technological improvement, and energy consumption. And I would encourage you to go and look at Gapminder. It's Gapminder, all one word, GAPMINDER.org. And look at Han Rosling's video, which is called 200 Years That Changed the World. And you very quickly realise that while we've got a massive impact of hydrocarbons that are infecting the environment, the amount of benefit it's brought to man is enormous. So that's kind of the first comment. But you're absolutely right. Through that energy growth, we've come to expect things that we wouldn't have had in the past. So everybody's very quick to criticise the hydrocarbon industry. Very slow to admit how they benefit. And my answer is, if you drive a car, take one flight a year to go on holiday, buy an avocado fruit in the supermarket if you live in the UK, or a kiwi fruit, then you're part of the problem. So to borrow from Christianity, you kind of have to take the plank out of your own eye before you take the speck out of your brother's eye. If we don't have massive lifestyle change, the UN's opinion is we will not meet net zero, and that goes in hand with what David actually said, and has alluded to. You know, what do we need to do in terms of lifestyle? And in fact, I'm a hypocrite. So, you know, I use computers. I own 2 cars. They're now a lot smaller. I don't drive them very often anymore. I used to fly a lot. I'm trying to stop flying. I do eat kiwi fruit. So I'm a hypocrite, and that's the problem. That our ability to criticise others, yet continue our own lifestyle. So there is this whole problem that it's somebody else's problem. The current attitude is it's government's problem and it's energy industry's problem. But we're the market. We are the consumers. The oil and gas industry have no market unless they have consumers. So you have to reduce the market, and then the market will naturally adjust. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, that's good. I've had some comments saying that people aren't able to unmute themselves. So if that's the case for everybody, then my apologies for that, and I'll aim to fix that next time. So there's some comments coming in. No, I think agreeing that energy consumption is a big part of the problem, or is the problem, rather than finding how to supply the energy. Another comment saying, yeah, converting to EVs is necessary but not sufficient. So kind of helpful, but doesn't really fix the problem.
Yeah, I think David's made a very good point. I'll read it out. He says, you know, the historical benefits of half carbon lifestyle is a gilded cage. And we live in cognitive dissonance in the UK, and I think that extends to other nations. And I think you make a really good point, David, that there is this cognitive dissonance, that we kind of justify our own lifestyle, and we kind of fool ourselves into thinking we're doing the kind of things that are right for the environment. I'll give you a really good statistic, actually, which wasn't from me. It was by a guy called Benjamin Sovacool, who's the professor of energy policy at Sussex University, which is actually where I'm studying for an energy policy MSc. He's the head of the energy policy unit. He's done a lot of studies. And we had a conference over the last 4 days, and he produced one amazing statistic that stuck in my mind. So he said, in Norway, about 67% of all new car sales are EVs. The Norwegian government's subsidy for one Tesla car to one middle class, and he used the word, probably advisedly, you know, white middle class Norwegian, the subsidy, that one subsidy for that one car for that one middle class, relatively high earner who can afford that Tesla, is equivalent to about 10,000 bus tickets in Oslo. So the idea that we go out, so it's very easy as somebody who's middle class, and I'm very middle class, although I grew up in a mining town, and I came from a very working class background, but I've been middle class ever since I went to university. When you're middle class, it's very easy to tell other people what to do and pronounce what you think is the solution. Yet, if you look at the statistics, we are the people that create the biggest carbon footprint. So David has made a really, really good point. Yeah.
Good. Right. Good question here from Adrian. So, assuming no reduction in CO2 emissions, when do you think we'll hit the 2-degree rise? And when does that climate tipping point start to kick in? Might not be too far away.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I don't really know the answer to that, and there's a lot of debate about that. So I'll make 2 comments. I think it's likely that. So the first question is when will we hit that 2-degree rise? I would say on current projections, on the current trajectory we're on, we'll probably hit that rise, that 2-degree rise, I think somewhere between 2030 and 2040, maybe out to 2050, but I don't know exactly. I don't have the number in my head. The second question that a lot of people have, and it's the favourite claim of the people we call climate deniers, is what do we mean by tipping point? So the challenge is we don't really know, if we're really honest, the overall impact of that 2-degree rise. We have ideas, and the risks are well qualified. But my argument is on the tipping point that. And the analogy I use is I don't wear my seatbelt in my car because I expect to crash every time I go out to drive. I go out, I put that seatbelt on as a risk mitigation against something that's so catastrophic, i.e. going through the windscreen of my car in a crash, that I just want to avoid it at all costs. So there's enough evidence that suggests that the risk is sufficient enough that we cannot afford to take the risk. So it's no point in debating whether or not 2 degrees is going to be a tipping point or not. We need to say the risk is just too great. We need to do everything we can do to mitigate it. So that's my argument on that, and I don't want to give any fuel to climate deniers. The other observation I'll make is, because I'm a geologist by training originally, is almost every single peak in CO2 in the Earth's history is associated with a mass extinction. Every single one. And in fact, I'll tell a funny story. In fact, I was in a very heated argument with a climate denier. Anybody who follows me on LinkedIn probably realizes that I get into very heated arguments with people who are pseudoscientists. And one guy published a plot of carbon variation through geological history. And since the Cambrian 500 million years ago, there's been massive variation in CO2. So his point was, CO2 has varied wildly in the history of the Earth, therefore it's not a problem. Unfortunately, the graph he used at every single peak in CO2 had labelled it with the mass extinction that had occurred. And he got really upset when I asked him why I'd used that graph, and asked him whether he was pointing out whether we were heading for a mass extinction. So the evidence is, from geological history and all of the modelling we've done, is that a rapid change in CO2 means that ecosystems cannot adjust quickly enough, and therefore there is such a massive disruption of the ecosystem that we will see very, very unfortunate consequences. So I think 2 degree is going to be hit. I think it will be hit, and I think that the risks are significant to our ecosystem and the sustainability of our current lifestyle. That would be my answer, which is kind of a balanced answer. So, and I'm not prepared, personally, I'm not prepared to take the risk, but we are going to find out.
Cool, thanks for that. Here's another interesting one. So dairy and meat production is also a large contributor to CO2 emissions. There's an issue right there. As countries increase the GDP, diets change, people eat more meat, etc. Yeah, so I guess the comment there is that food production accounts for a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, takes up half the planet's habitable surface. So, you know, how does that fit into the kind of energy discussion, energy optimization?
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, but clearly methane emissions from the cattle industry. Methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. I think it's hundreds of times more potent than CO2 from what I remember. Again, I don't have the numbers in my head. So that's one issue. There is, I think agriculture is about 25% of global emissions. And that is global emissions that are kind of outside of the natural carbon balance. So it's obviously in agriculture you can reabsorb some of that. So again, it comes down to really understanding what we can do to minimise. So unfortunately, it comes back to this idea of what I would call environmental exergy. What is the minimum amount of resource we can use to basically feed ourselves, bearing in mind that we probably just don't want to eat soya, although soya does a bit of CO2, and only soya. But it comes down to looking at a problem and saying how can we reduce it. And there are some interesting technologies. So for example, and I don't know how much it would contribute. I know there has been research in animal livestock and feeding them a particular feed that has a significant impact on the amount of methane cows produce. Without putting too fine a point on it, but reducing the number of cow farts you get per kilo of meat, and that there was some research published on that recently. But yeah, I mean, you have to look at everything. You have, CO2 emissions aren't just energy. It's agriculture, it's transport. Circular economies start to make more sense. So if you can cut down the amount of transport, then sourcing things locally is a good idea. That benefits local communities. The problem with sourcing everything locally in circular economies is there's been massive benefits of globalization, both economically. So without globalization, China wouldn't have got out of poverty. Without globalization, it's possible that Sub-Saharan Africa won't get out of poverty. So, and also in that globalization, there's massive technological spillover and technological transfer. So it's a really difficult issue, because on the one hand, you want a circular economy, you want to use less goods, you want to use less resources, but in doing that, you may harm the very people you're also trying to help. So when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, it's not just about energy, it's about the whole piece. You have to join up the whole thinking. And I just like this idea of environmental exergy, but you do have to think about the what we call externalities, unwanted effects of doing something. So if we suddenly stop importing, certain goods from certain countries, those countries will be in abject poverty. Classic example is, and it's been used a lot, is cobalt mining in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Democratic Congo is a very dangerous, dirty, polluting industry, and a lot of people have criticised EVs about it. But without those people working in that industry have nothing. They would have no income. So they would probably starve to death before they actually die of cobalt poisoning. So that's the problem. If you turn off the taps, somebody economically doesn't benefit, and that is the real challenge of this whole problem that we've described. I don't know if anybody's, and I just don't know how to solve that. The best way we can do it is consume a lot less energy in OECD countries, become a lot more efficient, and allow other countries to take up that energy we've been using. We need to share out energy usage more effectively between more countries and more people. That's kind of gone off at a tangent. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good.
I think we had one on.
Can you see these questions?
Yeah.
So I think, a lot of them are in direct response, and I think agreeing with what you're saying, or adding further comments.
Yeah, so there's, big tensions between globalized trade and localization of economies. Not sure where the balance lies, from David Colbert. And David, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is not, and economists are really struggling with that, and the policy theorists are really struggling with that. And it's absolutely obvious if you go and read the literature. It's such a difficult problem to solve. And then there was another question that I don't think we've covered, which was on, China's still investing in coal power plants. Do you think South Africa should do the same and invest in new coal power plants, taking into account 90% of the electricity is from coal, and to power EVs, one depends on electricity availability? So you can use coal plants if you go to the trouble of sequestrating the CO2 that's produced. Tom Baxter, who blogs a lot, is on LinkedIn, has made the point that capture of CO2 post-combustion is more efficient than producing hydrogen. So he's argued that point. You can gasify coal to make hydrogen. In fact, we did that. The UK used to run on gasified coal, and 50% of that gas was hydrogen. Not many people know that actually the UK had a hydrogen economy, although there was a lot of CO2 mixed in with that hydrogen. But, you know, it's kind of, well, am I going to build coal-fired plants so I can drive EVs? It doesn't feel like a very good use of energy. If we're building coal-fired plants where we encourage sequestration to allow economic development, and that economic development has a spillover effect where those people can afford to invest in renewables, then it's a difficult equation. I mean, China have kind of realised this. So a lot of people criticise China, but they're investing heavily in renewables, and they are trying to. They are slowing down their investments in coal plants, although they are still building them. It's really complicated politically in China because not all the decisions are actually made in some of them are made by provinces. So I don't know. I don't know if anybody has a better idea. I mean, you really want to avoid coal at all costs, but also, how do you then deny people the ability to economically grow? And just as an example, yeah, China's the biggest user of coal. They're also the biggest producer of solar cells in the world. They produce 8% of the world's solar cells right now. I think they own about 70% of the world's lithium mines as well, which creates other unwanted externalities. So that's, it is a good problem. Yeah, South Africa's reasonably well developed economy. It's just got a massive problem with the gap in income between the richest and the poorest. So South Africa is a really interesting case, and I don't know much about it, but it is a really interesting case. So any comments on that would be helpful.
There's a good one here, right? So energy sector, huge contributor for country's budget. Reduction of fossils will reduce country's income. How much of a contributor do you see that the energy sector is? I know there's published numbers. I can't remember them.
Oh, huge. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but the energy sector is worth billions and billions and billions. It's a significant percentage of economies. Yeah, so energy sector. So there has to be a realization that we need to compensate developing countries and encourage them not to go down the hydrocarbon route, encourage them to use renewables, and we have to compensate them from that. And I apologise, this is a slightly left-wing point of view. I guess most people are guessing that I'm probably left of centre politically. But just to use an example, in a developing country, how much does 100 billion buy? Quite a lot. The current cost of building a train line from London to Manchester, a high-speed train line, which is going to knock about 20 minutes off the travel time, roughly, 20-30 minutes, is 100 billion. The cost of subsidising a Tesla in Norway. What could you do with that money? How many solar panels could you buy for a Sub-Saharan country? So there's this enormous inequality that we're kind of, and I think David's hit the nail on the head, we're kind of protecting our gilded cage. And it's kind of, we'll be all right, Jack. The UK is going to be fine. We've got this bright and renewable future. We're going to be driving around in cool, funky looking EVs. We're going to have really great heat pumps. And that investment in reality could be taken and spent elsewhere that has a much bigger impact. And you can calculate that economically. There's plenty of economists who can tell you, if you spend this amount on this, what is the overall value? And it's called, for those that have done economics, it's basically the concept of social surplus. So how much surplus do you create by enacting a policy? So that's my answer, is that we have to compete with other countries. if we're asking them to sacrifice income. We can't just push people into poverty because we think people in the West are going to, or people, sorry, in developed countries, because it's not just West, it's East and West. We can't just ask people in developing countries to basically have a shorter life and have a low standard of living and have poor health, so we can maintain the lifestyle we've become accustomed to. I think that's the problem.
Yeah, no, that's good. So another comment here from David Calvert, which I think comes back to the point made earlier about how much hype is there around CCUS. So apparently from the UK government itself, they're saying that there's no commercial scale integrated CCS power plants at the moment. So, you know, we know that this stuff is really expensive. It's quite hard technically. I think capturing it is quite straightforward. You know, I've been doing that for many years. But then actually doing something with it is a more difficult problem to solve.
Yeah, I'm just reading the question. Yeah, so we've got the net zero target. You know, the MPV. So yeah, absolutely. So there's absolutely no doubt that if you go back through history and look at transitions, so the act of change and moving from one technology to another generates value, because otherwise we'd all be, you know, living in feudal England, digging potatoes with our hands, working for a lord. And so technology and the advancement in technology brings enormous economic value and allows us to escape the limit of labour and capital. So if you don't have technology, you basically reach a theoretical limit in what labour and capital can do. And combine that with depreciation of the things you're using, you basically get economic decline and we get poorer. So technology. So if we're interested in introducing new technologies, that has to logically have economic benefit. The other comment I'll make is the UK government and many governments around the world are engaged in probably the biggest experiment in market intervention we've ever seen. So typically the economists prefer to let the market just get on with it and decide. But we already know if we let the market just carry on, we'll probably carry on as normal. And the reason we'll carry on is because hydrocarbons are really high quality energy. It produces lots of benefit, makes a lot of people very wealthy, gives us a great lifestyle. So they're having to intervene in the market, but they also know, and I think it's fair to be fair to government, they also know that you have to try out lots of different niches and not all niches will succeed. So they know they're going to have to invest in all sorts of different technologies to try and see which ones will develop. The act of putting that money into those niche technologies, even though some of those niche technologies will fail, will have enormous benefit to communities. And the simplest example I can think of is a project we're involved in, which is a hydrogen hub in North Wales. So, you know, there's lots of risks with that project. There's good points and bad points about that project, but the simple act of investing in that project in North Wales is putting money into a community and an economy that's been depressed for tens of years or longer, actually, probably almost 50 years in North Wales. So it is a really good point. So yeah, I mean, there is enormous benefit of technological development. There's enormous benefit from R&D. And there is no doubt that governments need to intervene and they need to stimulate market. And they need to engage in two things. One is investing in subsidising the energy market until the market gets established. So they've done that with wind. They had feed-in tariffs for wind. That's disappeared now, so it worked for wind. Solar was the same. We had really big feed-in tariffs 10 years ago. That's dropped to more of a market. Hydrogen is, you know, we don't know where that's going yet, and we're experimenting with hydrogen. So yeah, I think that is the answer to the question. I think absolutely there are huge economic benefits in investing in new technologies. Yeah.
No, really good. I'm just looking at the time. We're just about up to the hour. I'm really sorry that we weren't able to make that second half hour a bit more kind of interactive in terms of discussion. I will aim to fix that for next time. We've had some really great comments. I'd love to just carry on reading them out and going through them, but I think in the interest of time we need to stop.
Yeah.
But
So,
I think Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I think we might suggest we do, Tony, is if anybody's on the line and are interested in taking part in the discussion next time, we can actually have a bit of a panel, because sometimes if you have 30 people trying to talk, it's very difficult. So the best combination is to have a selected panel, and then a number of people also asking questions by text. So if anybody's interested in, when we do the next one, actually joining the panel, then we can invite you as a co-presenter, which means you'll be able to talk. So we could do it that way, Tony. We could have a panel of 4 or 5 people.
That would be good. I mean, we set this one up really just as a bit of an experiment. Yeah. You know, see how much interest there was in about this stuff. Loads and loads of questions, which is great. So there's definitely interest there. So I think we'll continue to do this on a monthly basis. Probably the next one will be mid-April. But yeah, Simon says if anybody wants to join a panel for that, get in touch.
And we will be looking for guest speakers as well.
Excellent. Right. I think we should finish it there, just in the interest of time. Thank you, everybody that joined, and thanks for all your comments and questions. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.